Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Florey. Thank you very much for coming out in the middle of winter, and hope you find tonight's discussion informative. This is the 8th lecture, and we've been going for 3 years, and so just to explain to you that next one will be beginning at the beginning again and covering much of the same material. Fortunately, in the last 3 years, things have changed, and so the lectures won't be exactly the same, but I think 8 lectures about Parkinson's, I've probably covered most of it, and so hopefully this one is interesting, but it's from a different direction and really talking not so much about the medications, but about what you can do. Now, many of you are people I know. There will be some who may not know me, so a brief introduction. I'm a neurologist at St Vincent's Hospital and see people with Parkinson's. I also have a research lab here at the Florey and at the University of Melbourne. So tonight I wanted to take a discussion that to address some things that are not about the tablets and really to put things that are in the hands of people with Parkinson's and things that you can do. So this is a bit away from the sort of things we normally talk about, and I hope you do find it of interest. And the things I'm going to cover are aspects of physical fitness and why this is not just the normal sorts of things where doctors exhort you to be fitter, but why it has particular relevance to Parkinson's disease. Also mental fitness and why that's very relevant to Parkinson's. And speak a little bit about using your medications properly and making sure that you fit in well with your networks of family and friends. So first of all, physical fitness. So why would that be relevant to Parkinson's? Well, at one level there's a very obvious thing, and that is Parkinson's, amongst many things, is a disorder of movement, and if your movements are not as good as they should be, it's best if you're as strong as you can, that you're not carrying around more than you need to, and that your cardiovascular system is strong enough to actually make things work. So if you're 15 kilograms overweight, I would recommend you go home tonight, or tomorrow, find 15 kilograms and walk around with it a little bit and just see how much work that extra work it is, and think about what you would be like if you got rid of it. And so that's just from the fitness point of view, just thinking about the mechanics. And we certainly know that if we spend a bit of time making people with Parkinson's or getting people with Parkinson's to be fitter, that we can show statistically that they function better, have less falls, and overall perform better. And we're not sure why that is, but I'm going to talk about some of the actual practical things you can do. The last thing I want to talk about, or not last, but one of the important things I want to cover about this is some of the emerging research which suggests that being fitter, and importantly being the right weight, may actually slow the progression of disease down. So it's not just about the simple mechanics of carrying around less and being fitter, but it may actually be important for the disease itself. And talking particularly if you're in the earlier stages of the disease, preparing for the future is important because earlier in the disease you can do quite a lot to actually make yourself well positioned for handling the consequences when it's a bit harder to actually do some of the things I'm talking about. So, excuse me. One of the first things we have to address here is, so what is the right weight? So the best way of thinking about this is to look at the BMI. And the National Medical Health and Research Council says that it's a BMI of 20 to 25 is the right one. Now, there's a lot of argument about whether it's the right thing to use at a research level, but it's a really useful tool for just the rest of us to think about to see whether you're in the right range. So you calculate your BMI by your weight in kilograms divided by your height squared. Now, if you don't know how to do this and your mobile phone calculator doesn't work, you can look it up on this web page, and I'm going to refer to quite a lot of web pages, and they will be on the Florey's web page. You can download them all and look at them after the talk. But for example, I'm 71 kilograms and I'm 1.79 meters high, so my BMI I can boast is 22, which is in the right range. But that's how you work it out. And so it's a very simple way to go and look in the right position. Now, very many people who are of the age of getting Parkinson's are beginning to creep up into 25, 26, 27, 28, and even up to 30, and that matters. For example, if you're a typical, what we used to call the Collingwood 6-footer, you know, sort of about 5'10" in the old language, and you're 85 kilograms, then you're carrying around about 7 kilograms more than you should be. And that has a consequence in the way we talked about. So what do you do? So simply, if your BMI is over 25, you should reduce your intake and increase your consumption, because your weight is really pretty simple. It's the energy used minus the energy consumed. So both things are important. It's not just good enough to not eat and not exercise. You actually need to do both, and there's a reason why both of these matter, and I'm going to come back to why it matters for Parkinson's in particular. So there are some very simple steps to take. Up there is a website which, if you want to go in and look at it in more detail, this is from the National Health Service in the UK, a very reputable site about talking what to do. Now, if you're going to lose weight, remember, it's going to take you something like 6 months to lose about 8 kilograms. So don't expect it to happen. You have to change your practices, and this is why I'm talking about taking approach for Parkinson's. So first of all, if you are overweight, reduce your intake, measure, use a diary, because you can kid yourself, it's really easy. So if you don't write it down, you won't know how much you're exaggerating how little you eat. And ask a dietitian if you don't know what to do. The next thing is not only reduce what you eat, but reduce calories. And there's some simple things. Get rid of carbohydrates, the simple ones, the simple sugars. So no soft drinks that have sweeteners in them. Take little alcohol, because alcohol's got a lot of sugar in it. Don't eat between meals or after evening meals, so don't snack, just cut it down to a short number of meals. Increase fluids. Now, this is important because it gives you a sense of fullness in your stomach, but it also is important if you're in the first 5 years of Parkinson's, because later on you will need to have an adequate volume to avoid the effects of low blood pressure, which commonly come with later Parkinson's. If you practice having a regular 2 litres in a day, then it isn't a problem later on when you actually have to have 2 litres in a day, so you don't get dizzy and faint all the time. And exercise. So again, why? There's first of all the simple reason that it helps to use weight loss because you consume a lot of energy, but you're going to have to probably walk about 1 kilogram to justify eating 2 bananas. So, a kilometre to justify 2 bananas. So just by using energy alone, it's not really the right answer. But the real reasons are the secondary effects. So it helps with mood. This is one of the spin-offs. We know that if you take a person who's depressed, and this has been a trial that was done, so people were given into 3 arms. One was to do exercise alone. The other one was to see a GP and use the standard measures that a GP would use to treat it. And the third one was to see a psychiatrist and take their treatment. The people who exercised and had no medication did better than seeing the GP and about as good as seeing the psychiatrist. So this is not talking about all forms of depression, but we're talking about general low mood that would otherwise have been treated with perhaps antidepressants. And the reason this probably happens, although we don't know for sure, is that exercise releases a growth factor or a protein in the blood and in the brain called brain-derived neurotrophic factor. I'm going to call it BDNF. And I'm going to come back to this process, but it has an effect on helping neurons to grow and survive. And remember BDNF and its friend GDNF, because I'm going to talk about them again in the brain and Parkinson's as to why they're important. And the next reason is with disease prevention. And again, I'm going to go into this in greater detail later on, because GDNF is important at making dopamine cells survive, and it seems that with exercise, at least in rats, that you can save the dopamine neurons that are lost in Parkinson's disease, and we suspect in humans in clinical trials that that may be doing the same thing. And the other reason is that the one I addressed at the beginning is that it helps to manage symptoms. It makes people stronger, fitter, and lighter if you have a problem with movement. So what sort of exercise? Well, we don't know, unfortunately, so we tell people that you should do two sorts. One is the cardiovascular fitness, the sort of things that you would be told if you had a heart problem, which is 30 minutes 5 times per week. And it's hard to say how much exercise one should do, because if you're a fit person, then you need to do enough to keep that level of fitness. If you're not very fit, you need to build up to it. So a rule of thumb is that however fit you are, if your exercise is strenuous enough to make it hard for you to talk to someone during that 30 minutes, then you're doing it at about the right level. You don't want to, don't just jump in and do it though. If you build up to it slowly, we don't want you having problems with ischemic heart disease and chest pain. Just build it up slowly, and if necessary, talk to your general practitioner about whether it's appropriate. But you can easily build up that process so you're doing 30 minutes 5 times a week. And as you get fitter, you'll be able to walk further and walk faster. But if you keep the level just where it's hard to talk, then you're keeping at the right level for your level of fitness. The other form of exercise that people recommend, and this would be true if you're a male without Parkinson's and over 55, is to be spending some time building muscle up. And so that usually involves, just come to that in a minute, that usually involves having to go to a gym, and there's probably good reason that this sends different messages around that protein I called BDNF before. And so particularly if you're a male, it's a good idea to spend probably 3 days a week doing some exercises that are muscle building. And if you're female, there's evidence that it probably works there, particularly if you have Parkinson's disease. So the other task is to make sure it happens. And this, doing exercise and having diets, but are both littered with the good intentions. And it's very hard to make the change and ensure that you really do it. So use a friend and or your dog. But in other words, have a reason to exercise and have a commitment because you have to go and meet somebody. Set goals, e.g. try and set yourself to be able to walk the full distance for the Parkinson's disease walk every year, run through Parkinson's Victoria, or to walk in Oxfam, or little milestones like that. And there's a website for the Oxfam one. Join a gym with a friend or in a group, and hopefully that gym has a swimming pool so that you can swim and bike ride and run and walk and do a range of exercises and mix it up with other interesting things. So vigorous dancing is a very good exercise, and it's got a different set of interests, and it has also good actions for Parkinson's disease in the way that we talked about, I think, the last lecture. And give yourself rewards for doing it. So have a cup of coffee, but hopefully not a cake at the end of it, and meet with friends and make it a social outing and join in. If you're, I was talking with Fred before, get your Parkinson's support group to commit to doing something like that. It's a very good idea to actually get greater involvement. But the key issue is you need to have your goal to get your BMI into the right range. Now, why would that matter in terms of slowing down Parkinson's? So one of the clues to this is a recent study, came out middle of this year, but it harks back to some ideas that have been floating around in the Parkinson's research now for probably 15 years. This was a study done in the UK using a medication called exenatide, which is an approved treatment for diabetes. And it's not available for treating Parkinson's yet, and in fact I think our recommendation would be is don't go out and put yourself on it. Make sure it's done in the setting of a clinical trial because this drug does have side effects, and one of the side effects is that it causes weight loss. And that's led to some of the thinking about why it might be important in terms of slowing down Parkinson's. So in this small study, and stress it was a small study, people were put on a placebo, that is, they couldn't tell whether they were taking the drug or a similar looking substance, and they didn't know which one they were on. And the subjects who were participating were asked to stop all of their medications at the beginning so people could see what they were like without the symptom-treating drugs like Matapar and Sinemet, etc. They were then given the drug for 18 months and the placebo, and then it was stopped again, and their levels of function was, all of their other drugs were stopped again, and their level of function was examined in the off state after they had been off their drugs for 3 weeks. And the people who had had the exenatide had declined less in their function than the people who didn't. So it wasn't that it made them better, but it seemed to be slowing the rate of progression without the medications. So this needs to be corroborated, but needs to be substantiated that it really works before leaping in and saying exenatide slows the progression of disease. But the reason that I'm telling you about it today is that it raises questions which people have had around a long time as to how might weight loss and exercise slow Parkinson's. So in previous lectures we've talked about this protein called alpha-synuclein, and in the brain of everybody who has Parkinson's this is a cell from the part of the brain that's affected with Parkinson's disease, and these little pale things with a halo around them are called Lewy bodies. And they were discovered in 1912 by a pathologist called Lewy in Paris, and they remained a mystery as to what they were doing there until the late 1990s, when it was discovered that they were full of this protein called alpha-synuclein. And alpha-synuclein had been put on the map with Parkinson's a year earlier when a family with hereditary Parkinson's were found to have a mutation in the gene for this protein. And so linking the idea that it genetically can cause Parkinson's, rarely, but that everybody who has Parkinson's has an abundance of this protein in the Lewy body, meant that people were interested in how this alpha-synuclein comes to be collecting within nerve cells of people with Parkinson's disease. Now, I'm just going to give you, you will have seen this picture before if you've been to my lectures, but just again to remind you, inside the A cell are a whole lot of functions. There's the nucleus, which has the blueprint for making proteins, and there's the factory called the endoplasmic reticulum, which uses the blueprint to actually manufacture the protein. So it's the factory site where proteins are produced, and then they're sent out to actually do their function, and some of them are actually exported to the rest of the world. And there's also a system here called the lysosome autophagy system, which recycles proteins that have become damaged or redundant or in excess. And we're going to talk about this structure. And there's the powerhouse up here which drives all of this manufacturing and processes within the cell. So alpha-synuclein seems to be accumulating inside the cell, these Lewy bodies, because of a problem with this garbage disposal system, or the autophagy pathway that I talked about before. Now, normally alpha-synuclein is a soluble protein. It floats around the cell doing its job. We don't know what its job is, but it seems to be floating around there doing it. And it's normally a very soluble protein and gets cleared of through a normal soluble protein disposal mechanism called the autophagy system. But when the presence of Parkinson's disease, it stops being soluble, becomes insoluble, and we think that makes it toxic. And so in an attempt to sequester it away, the protein gets squirreled up into this Lewy body, which is like a toxic dump to keep it out of harm's way. And so really having the Lewy body there is a good thing in the sense that it's showing that the cell is working hard to try and stop damage from happening. but it's also a sign that things are a little bit unhappy in the cell in terms of the garbage disposal mechanism. So what we think in Parkinson's, as we've mentioned before, is that there's been a tip in favour of the toxic dump mechanism because this disposal system isn't working so well. And if we were able to tip it back this way, then we might actually go some directions to improving the processes of the disease itself. So we talked before about this autophagy system, or the proper disposal mechanism, and its job is to take reusable molecules so that it's a recycling system. So as the protein is damaged or excess to capacity, instead of just throwing it out, this disposal system pulls the protein apart, takes all the components and sends it back to the cell to be used again so that energy is conserved and you don't need to use as much, don't have to have as much intake or taking it into the cell. And so those proteins get used again for energy, for essential services within the cell, and for renovating the cell membranes and sort of maintaining the cell in a healthy state. But there's a switch here which says turn this on or off, and when it's turned off there tends to be more stuff sent in this direction. And one of the important controllers of this is it gets turned off if we don't need energy. In other words, I'll just keep pointing up here. In other words, if at the time of starvation, and if you see this happens in people who are genuinely starved and malnourished, they start using their protein systems and actually burning up muscle and cell membranes and so on for reuse. And so this mechanism is not to stop us getting Parkinson's, but to actually allow us to go through bad times and droughts to actually use the internal proteins for reuse. And this system of gobbling up unneeded protein is working much more actively when starvation is there and gets turned off when we've got no need for energy, when we're eating too much, or when we're not exercising enough. On the other hand, if you go the other direction and starve yourself and use plenty of energy, then you increase that pathway and turn it back on. Now, if indeed in Parkinson's disease this switch has been tended to be off or overloaded and we could turn this process on, that would be a good system because it would shift less stuff in this direction and more stuff in that direction. So we've known for a long time that people who are calorie restricted, and we particularly know in animals because we can do the experiment that if you not starve an animal but actually reduce their calorie intake, they live a lot longer and they seem to be more resistant to experimental neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's and motor neuron disease. We also know that humans who are calorie restricted seem to be more resistant to neurodegenerative diseases. We haven't been sure, but we suspect that this is the mechanism. So our suspicion is that if someone is overweight and not exercising properly, whether it's because that was their normal state or whether it's being forced on them by an illness which gets in the way of their mobility, that it's not helping this switch. Whereas if you have a drug like exenatide, which makes you lose weight, and we think that this is a drug-related way of turning the switch, or whether you turn it on by healthy exercise, there's a reason to think that this might be slowing down the progression of the illness. The other thing is that we know that if you have, make a rat, give it Parkinson's on one side, and force the animal to restrict the use of the good side and force the animal to use its affected side, then less nerve cells die in the region of the Parkinson's brain because this GDNF that I talked about is released. We also know that exercise and reducing your calorie intake or tipping the calorie balance seems to release this GDNF, as does being stimulated by a novel environment and being active and healthy, and also by lifting your mood. So we think these are probably important processes, perhaps in disease prevention, but most likely also, although I can't say hand on heart that this is proved, in actually slowing the progression of the disease once it's there. So I wanted to talk now about the things you can do with exercise at these various stages. And broadly, I think of Parkinson's as having early years, which is 3 doses of levodopa a day. Don't need to worry about the timing of the medications because they seem to look after themselves. The middle years where you get involuntary movements and you have to be careful about the timing of the medications. And the late years when balance and other problems begin to encroach on the disease. So the thing about the early years, in some ways some of the things I'm talking about here have a lot to say at that stage, is you can change your habits and you can make plans and you can do exercise. They're things they're in your gift to do something pretty easily about. And people with Parkinson's do tend to have a higher BMI than the rest of the population in this early stage. Not all of them, but many of them do. And overall, if you look at the overall Parkinson's community in the early years and the general age-matched community, BMI and weight is higher in the Parkinson's group. In the mid-years, it's a little harder to do these things because you've less capacity to influence it because of the effect of the disease, both on your ability to change your plans and your habits, and you still may often have high BMI and exercise even less because of the disease, but you can still do it. And so what can you do? Well, diet still matters, and particularly if you and those you live with collectively make a plan to get engaged with that and put your BMI in the normal range by the things we talked about and plan routines. And particularly in these later years, actually having a routine and a process is really important, because otherwise you will tend to let things drift along unless there is a clock and a program and a partner telling you time to do the next thing and keep on moving to it. So it is very important in those middle years to actually put that process in place. In the middle years, you also get people who begin to have weight loss and low BMI. So we often find with Parkinson's, and I'll draw it your way, that we're going along this way, doing pretty well, weight up a little bit, and then suddenly weight drops off quite sharply. And there's often a bit of concern about, well, why have I lost this weight? Now, very commonly it is the Parkinson's. You shouldn't assume that. You should go and talk to your doctor and ask about your neurologist or your GP and ask whether it needs to be investigated further. But the reason that people suddenly lose weight is often because it's about the time that you start to get the involuntary movements, and they often come with slightly increased elevation of temperature, and it has effect on the part of the brain that regulates temperature regulation, and this resets the efficiency of the protein consumption, and weight can, at least that's what we think happens, and weight goes down quite sharply because of that and then plateaus again. And it's even more common in these later years when there's weight loss, and at this time, because particularly if you're not exercising, bones become weaker, and less exercise is again more of a trouble if you don't start to attend to the problem of reduced weight. So to make sure you're not confused, I have been talking about a high BMI in these early stages, and now I'm switching weight to what happens if you have a low BMI in the later stages, which is quite common to do. So I'm switching tack now. We've talked about what to do if your weight is over, and I'm going to now what you do if your weight is under. So a BMI under 20 is a bad thing to have, and I'm going to talk about why it is. And if your BMI is under 20, you increase your protein, not your calories, your protein. So when your BMI is high, cut out your calories, exercise more. When your BMI is low, increase your protein. And why do this? Because if your BMI is low, you have low energy, you feel tired and lethargic, you often get insomnia and sleep badly, and often get anxiety just from being underweight. So forget whether you've got Parkinson's. If you've got a low BMI, particularly not just under 20, but getting down towards the 18 level, it's not uncommon to have effects on your thinking and on your mood, sleep and lethargy, activity levels. And when I say it reduces cognitive function, it means that people just find it hard to think clearly. And people can get other features such as chest pain and palpitation just from being underweight, and increased rate of infection. So it's an important thing to not just let drift along. And first of all, as I said before, how do we treat it? Well, not every problem is Parkinson's, so don't just assume because you've lost weight it's the Parkinson's. Find out why you've lost weight. Just check there's not another reason. And what do? Well, you eat more frequently. So remember, with overweight, I said eat less frequently, 3 meals a day. Here you should increase the number of meals to 5 or 6 and increase calories, but more importantly, increase protein. And the things that have protein are eggs, meat, dairy, milkshakes and smoothies with protein and calories in them, snacks with meat, cheese and yogurt. And you can get commercially available sources of protein like sustagen to increase it. And exercise, again, because it increases muscle mass and therefore your weight, and it also, just exercising can stimulate your appetite as well, and it has all of the reasons we've already talked about. So the last reason for physical exercise is that it's preparing for future problems, and I talked about the issue that if you're stronger, lighter and fitter, that it's a good thing to be ready for later on when your walking perhaps and mobility is not as good as it is now. And it also has an effect on your blood pressure. If you exercise more, you control your blood pressure better and you don't need blood pressure lowering agents which get in the way of postural hypotension. It helps with constipation in the gut, which becomes an increasing problem throughout the course of Parkinson's. It helps with your sleep, which becomes an increasing problem throughout the course of Parkinson's, and I'm going to talk about it. And as we've already discussed, it helps your mood. So there are many reasons why I would stress again, get fit. So, off my soapbox for that one, and move on to sleep, which is a problem in Parkinson's. So this is something else where I think as a group, people with Parkinson's can do something about themselves without it necessarily being a medical problem. So the first thing to do is recognise that it's there, and this might seem a bit obvious, but the problem is that people who have a daytime sleepiness don't know that they have a daytime sleepiness. It's other people recognise it, and it's very common for them to say, but I don't do it, but everyone else around says, ah, yes you do. And so listen to what other people are saying. And it's often associated with also there can be waking during the night, problems with early rising, late to bed. They're all factors which will contribute and also part of it. There are problems if you're getting up more than 2 times to empty your bladder, frequent cause of troubles with sleep. And it's also noted by keeping the bed partner awake with snoring and bad dreams. And I'm going to talk about them and the kicking and thrashing movements that come with Parkinson's. So there are 2 broad causes why people have trouble with sleep. There's the one down the bottom. They're not to do with Parkinson's, so don't assume that everything you have is Parkinson's. You too can have sleep apnea. It's treatable and fixable. And people who get up many times during the night, particularly men, women won't have problem obviously with prostate, but women do have problem with bladder floor, and that can be, they can be addressable if not necessarily fixable problems. And many people without Parkinson's have poor sleep habits going into the disease, and the disease only exacerbates that problem, and that is they've never really learnt to sleep properly, perhaps after having children or a job working at night. But there are many Parkinson's related causes why you will have trouble, can have trouble sleeping. First of all is diurnal rhythm. By what we mean by that is that there's a clock which sends you to sleep at your habitual time of bed and wakes you up, gets your temperature to rise about half an hour before your normal waking time. And if you go on an overseas trip, you know what diurnal rhythm does to you. It gives you jet lag. And Parkinson's causes that diurnal rhythm to change so that you sleep less at night and therefore need more sleep in the day. Pain related to Parkinson's or other causes can cause nighttime sleep disturbances. We've talked about the bladder, and loss of the effect of Parkinson's medications overnight can reduce bladder floor instability and cause you to have to get up more. And if your blood pressure is low during the daytime, then it tends to be high at night, so your kidneys work harder and the bladder fills up more. There's this condition we call rapid eye movement, or REM sleep disorder. And this is a disorder where you wake up and go through the motions of living your dreams, but while you're still asleep. So just to briefly explain this, the part of the brain on the top, the walnut-looking thing that you see in pictures, is called the cortex, and that's the thinking part of the brain. When we go to sleep, it gets disconnected from the moving apparatus that's down in the brainstem and spinal cord. And that means you can have dreams without sleepwalking or thrashing around and living them out. Now, if for some reason that gets reconnected, you will sleepwalk, and children have a much weaker disconnection than adults do, so they're more prone to sleepwalking. But Parkinson's tends to cause this process to disconnect, which is why, particularly again, more common in men, but women as well, people start living out their dreams often before the Parkinson's is diagnosed. It can occur 10 years or so beforehand. Now, this is not a dangerous thing or a bad thing in itself, but it just causes a lot of disruption to your partner's sleep. Anxiety, for whatever reason, and we're going to talk about this later on, can disturb sleep. The medications cause daytime sleepiness and can disrupt the nighttime sleep. Some of them can. And impulsive behaviours, which are partly caused by the Parkinson's and partly exacerbated by some of the medications, cause people to find it harder to give up obsessive behaviours or obsessions, particularly around the TV, the computer and cleaning, and go to bed and stop doing them at the time that they're meant to do it. And so they often take the computer into the bedroom at night. So why is it important? Well, it causes a lot of problems to your social life and how well you feel. It may be treated. Daytime sleeping may lead to you losing your license, or perhaps should lose your license. It disturbs your mood and often makes people a bit apathetic and slows down your capacity to think. We think it may affect the prognosis, although we're not sure about that. And it also may not be PD and might be treatable. So there are reasons for thinking about it. So what can you do? So again, it depends on whether it's Parkinson's related or not Parkinson's related. So if it's PD related, improve your sleep hygiene, establish routines. And so that means make sure you go to bed at the same time each night. And go to bed to sleep, not to read, to watch the TV, to play on the computer. Go to bed to sleep. Slow down in the hours before you need to go to sleep. So if you've been overseas and you've got jet lag, you know you're not going to get back into the rhythm unless you exercise and get sunlight in the daytime, and then try and battle to go to sleep at the same time every night. So don't have an argument half an hour before you go to bed. Don't go and do something like try and work out the tax half an hour before you go to bed. Don't do things that are going to get yourself wound up. Do things that help yourself to relax and wind down and catch the wave when the sleep occurs. But it's about getting a routine. No computers, TVs, books in the bedtime. Don't read in bed. Exercise, but exercise in the daytime, not half an hour before you go to bed. Gets all of the activating hormones and so on up and going, and you don't want that to happen. Fix your BMI, because overweight people sleep badly. Fit and proper weight people who are exercising sleep a lot better. If it's not your Parkinson's, again, recognise there's a problem. Ask your doctor whether it is a non-Parkinson's related thing like sleep apnea, and take the steps they recommend. So I'm just going to talk about the sleep-related problems in a little bit more detail. And so the things I've marked in red, I've called them general advice, and they're the things I've just talked about. But the things that are not in red, they have a particular solution. So things like pain at night can often be fixed by using nighttime medications. bladder disturbance can often, not always, be fixed by using nighttime medications, but unfortunately they might also lead to some of these things like REM sleep disorder. So what you win on some, you might lose on the other, but I'm just saying what you can do for each one. It doesn't mean that's always going to work for you. Restless legs can be treated often with drugs like clonazepam or with some of the anti-Parkinson's drugs themselves. The REM sleep disorder, it's usually done by reducing the nighttime medication, so perhaps take your last medication earlier in the evening, but that might then compete with the problems here. Anxiety, use the sorts of approaches that we talked before and some of the general ones. Medications, if they're causing daytime sleepiness, talk to your doctor about that. He mightn't be or she mightn't be aware that you have a daytime sleepiness problem if you don't tell them. And impulsive behaviours, there's first of all the general advice, that is don't try and play on the computer and do the housework 5 minutes before bed, but also talk to your doctor about the fact that there is an impulse control disorder there, because again, it can't be fixed if there's no conversation about it. Sleep apnea, sleep study, prostate and bladder 4, seek surgery or medical advice about whether it can be fixed. I've done that already. So I'm going to keep moving because I want to finish in time. So lastly, I think this is the last thing I was going to talk about, nearly last. Anxiety is a very big problem in Parkinson's, and there are, again, I'm going to talk about the causes of it, but it is a bigger problem than just having a disease like Parkinson's. And again, the key to understanding anxiety and doing something about it is to recognise what it is. Now, anxiety is a tricky problem because it's one of those conditions where it makes perfect sense to be worried about what you're worrying about, but it's the degree to which it's disrupting your life. And so when someone says, look, you're being anxious, and the person comes back and says, well, wouldn't you worry about this if you were there? Well, it's quite reasonable you would, but it's the degree to which rumination and returning to the problem and trying to solve the problem over and over again keeps going. So this focus on what will happen, how will it happen, what if I can't, and going around that over and over again is what constitutes anxiety. So everybody has anxiety, and they should, because anxiety is what makes things interesting and makes us look forward to things and puts us on edge a little bit. You know, think about people who like football. Well, you get a bit anxious about whether your team's going to win. You sit on the edge while it's playing. That's why you enjoy it. But you go too far, and usually what anxiety that is damaging is the anxiety where you feel you can't solve the problem. It's out of your hands to fix it, and it's not going to go away. And you go back to it over and over again, and then that starts to become damaging. So it leads to problems with focusing and concentration and impairs your ability to think clearly and leads to poor concentration and fatigue. So the reason it's there is there are general factors. So if you took away Parkinson's and look at the age group who gets Parkinson's, that is people who are near their retirement or near the end of their working life, then there is often a degree of apprehension about how you're going to manage the transition from waking up in the morning and having something to do and then not transitioning to actually what are you going to do next. And any illness like Parkinson's causes that problem to say, well, I had things to do, but now this has got in the way, and how am I going to do it? And what's the future going to hold for me? I have people to look after, a mortgage to pay, I have young children, or whatever these things are. They become important factors and understandable. But there are also PD-related things, such as many of the medications cause anxiety, particularly as they're wearing off. And also there is a particular problem with Parkinson's that makes it harder for people to have what we call executive function. And by that I mean the problem to figure out your way through a problem. And if you're anxious, that becomes harder to do. Now, I'm going to spend a little bit of time explaining this because it's a key idea about why anxiety is important and what you can do about it. So, and some of you will have heard me say this before, so I'm sorry if you've heard the analogy. But if I've been on an overseas trip. I arrive in France, Charles de Gaulle Airport, flown all night, so I'm short of sleep. I can't speak French. My plane is late, and I've got to be across in Terminal 5, and I've come in Terminal 1, and I don't know how to get there, and I've got to get there in 10 minutes. And what happens? You get anxious. And you're not sleeping well, so you're not thinking at your best. And in that process, you're really set up to make some, you look back afterwards and said, I probably wouldn't have done that if I hadn't been so flustered and fussed, and I would have thought differently. And what that's really saying is that when I'm tired, when I'm anxious, sleep deprived, and a bit disoriented, my executive function doesn't work very well. Now, executive function is, we also call it working memory, or the capacity to handle 2 or 3 things going on together. And if you've got Parkinson's and you're not sleeping well and the medications are getting in the way and you're anxious, and the disease itself has a little bit of a toll on, or can have quite a bit of a toll on your ability to, on your working memory or ability to solve problems, then you're really going to make your cognitive function decline. Now, one of these things, and some or more of them, you can do something about. So anxiety is something you can address, and if you don't address it, it really does impair your ability to nut things out. So why is it important? Well, I've probably talked about these fairly quickly, but quality of life is one. It's not a lot of fun being anxious. But the other thing which is important is that if you think about people who are anxious because they've got a new job, but you know that with time you're going to get on top of it and it'll settle down, that's an anxiety that you are master of. But people who are trapped and can't resolve their anxiety, and it's the same thing and you feel you've got no way out of it, if that keeps going and going, over a period of time you then become depressed. And once you're depressed, you can't treat the anxiety until you fix the depression. And we don't want people to get to that stage, so it's important again to deal with the anxiety before it gets out of hand. It affects the management of Parkinson's because it becomes harder for the doctor to, as I think it does anyway, from my position, to explain to someone their way forward about how to solve problems. And it gets in the way of relationships, and it impairs sleep in a way that we've talked about already. So what to do? So simplify life, and that might sound like it's easier said than done, but if you go back to me being at Charles de Gaulle, is that if I'd just stopped, thought a minute about what had to be done, it would have actually looked a whole lot simpler, but it's actually allowing all of the thoughts to be sitting in your head that makes it harder to solve the problem. So most people with, one of the difficulties is that many people with Parkinson's were able to cope with a lot going on in their earlier life. And then they find that when a lot is happening at once, it's a bit like being in Charles de Gaulle Airport. So try and reduce the complexity of what you're trying to do at once. So, for example, I often hear, particularly with people in the later stages of Parkinson's disease, is that when the family and the grandkids all come down for lunch, that they sit quietly and don't do anything, and they get a bit worn out and tired. And that's because, when all the grandkids come around, they make a lot of noise, everything's going at once, people are talking over each other, and that's not a way of simplifying, it's actually complicating it. Whereas one-on-one you can do a whole lot more, and actually you can interact better. Look for meaningful roles, and this is true of whether or not you've just had an illness like Parkinson's, but the thing that makes it useful and easy to solve a problem is if you're doing something that you can concentrate on and that you find that you think is worthwhile to do. And I don't know what that's going to, each person is going to find something different that is worthwhile. But one of the problems with Parkinson's is if you used to be someone who liked doing handyman stuff and you find it hard to get up the ladder, you've got to think, well, what are you going to do now? But if you can either run up the flag, or you can say, well, where else is there somewhere that I can go and do something that is useful and valuable that I will like and other people will think is important. I've talked about routines already, and I've talked about exercise and getting your weight down or your weight right and its effect on medication. Sometimes it's actually necessary to look for medications to help treat the anxiety. It's not something we would do first of all. We would want to do what I'm going to talk about next first, but it's not the end of the world if that's what you have to do. And also address the question of whether depression is there. And again, that's an important thing to think about and raise as a discussion. Now, mindfulness is this idea, and this is not my drawing, this has come off this website, and I actually think they might have nicked it from another website, but it doesn't really matter too much. But it's this idea of, if you like, this is me at Charles de Gaulle having a whole lot of things running through my mind at once and not stopping and actually waiting to actually figure out what's going on and looking around and paying attention to what I'm going to do next and putting things in little steps one by one. Now, this is something that can be learnt, and it's something that you can get advice around. And this website here is a place where you can go to actually get advice from the website or actually make appointments to see people. Many of your GPs will actually know of local referrals to people who can help you with this very important way of addressing the problems of anxiety. I think, again, many of you heard of cognitive behaviour therapy, which is a way of being able to look in at yourself and reflecting on how you are thinking. And perhaps a way of using this is that most of us can't help what comes into our mind, but we can all help which thoughts we entertain. And cognitive behaviour therapy and mindfulness is a way of looking at what are the things you're thinking about. Are you actually ruminating? Can I actually put this away and stop going back to this and go and do something else? And so I do think this is an important thing for, particularly early in the journey in Parkinson's, but really at any stage to try and think about these ways of managing the stresses of an illness. And lastly on that point, it's important, I think, a really key thing to remember that you're a person fundamentally and you're not being defined by your Parkinson's. You do have Parkinson's, and it's a key issue, that's why we're all here, I think, but it's not the defining element of who you are. And that's one of the ways of getting trapped in Parkinson's and in anxiety. Last slide, or nearly last. It is important to know your medications. I can't, as a neurologist or your carer, really get you to understand and take your tablets on time and you get up routines for doing that. But taking them on time, it's a true fact, just a truism. Medications don't work unless they get in you. And if you don't take them, they won't work. And if you don't take them on time, they're not going to have an effective function as if you're taking them intermittently. Understand what the side effects are. Again, ask your doctor if you think they're side effects, because they may not be, but they may be, and there's often things we can do something about. Understand what you're trying to why you're taking them, what are they meant to do. For example, can you tell the difference of when you're off? Do you know what it means to be off? In other words, bradykinetic. Do you know why you're taking those medications? And this isn't a lecture for tonight, otherwise this is a whole lecture to talk about what these medications do. But it is important that you understand the difference between tremor and the involuntary movements of dyskinesia, and when your blood pressure is low and when it isn't. So again, you're the expert on your particular version of the disease, and if you can help your doctor understand it, it makes a big difference. And lastly, an advertisement, if you want to participate, the Australian Parkinson's Disease Registry is, we're still collecting, and if you would like to participate, Sarah would love to hear from you. So I think we've got a very short time for questions, but if anyone feels that they really have to go, I'm not going to be insulted if you have to get up and go before the questions are finished, so please feel free to leave if you wish. Yep.
How effective is this educational material in motivating people to actually go and do these things in terms of BMI management and exercise.
So this is not the only one there's no motivational material that I've put up here. The only area which may, in a sense, be called motivational is the Mindfulness website, but that's really to educate someone how to reflect on themselves, to be aware of their thinking. All of the rest, they're simply tools about how do you measure your BMI, what can you do to reduce your weight, what can you do to do exercise. So they're not, if you're looking for a motivation to get fit, don't look there. Unfortunately, I think this is something, if you go back to the title of the lecture, what can you do? And it's very much putting that emphasis on really this only is going to work if you actually take it seriously.
One of the problems in medicine, I suspect, is having people do what their doctor tells them to do. And I'm just wondering what sort of uptake are you seeing with all this very good information?
Well, there's a difference between the art and the science of medicine. The science of medicine is knowing how things work and how to use the tablets and what to prescribe. And the art is cajoling people to do something that they mightn't otherwise want and somehow rather twisting their arm to do it. So I think the effective, and I'll give you another little truism that was said to me early in my career, is that remember that the patient is the one with the disease. So I can't, I haven't got the disease. I can't do anything else but give advice. And my task is to convince patients of the value of doing things for themselves. And one of the problems with a consultation in medicine is the focus is around the tablets and the science of medicine. And the reason I've given tonight's lecture is because I don't think as doctors we have enough time to actually attend to all of these other things because they're not actually things that we have to deal with, and you don't need to see us to do it. So it tends to get fallen off the agenda, even though I think it's a very important thing. So we probably are guilty about not saying it enough.
I've heard that in some countries cannabis has been used to treat people with PD. Has there been any research to show whether it really does help? And if so, what are the prospects of having cannabis approved for medical purposes in Australia?
The last one I think is a political question, and I couldn't possibly answer how our politics work. But the first one I can actually talk a little bit about, and that is that there's been no comprehensive study of cannabis in the treatment of human Parkinson's disease. However, cannabis is a drug of addiction, and we know that there are cannabinoid receptors on dopamine cells and that it does affect the release of dopamine. So just for your information, every addictive drug works by directly or indirectly releasing dopamine. And dopamine is the chemical that you're wanting to have more of in Parkinson's disease. So there is the artificial cannabinoids, the newer drugs, do seem to be effective in animal models and in tissue slice in stabilizing the release of dopamine in people with functioning dopamine terminals. The difficulty is that by probably about 5 years into the illness, once involuntary movements occur, the number of functioning terminals is very small. And so the location for where cannabinoids can act is really much smaller. And so it's unclear whether it really would be effective or not in that stage of the disease. On the other hand, if you take it away from this very narrow focus about what its role would be in dopamine, it's a very good anxiety-depressing drug. And so it may be useful in that way, but it also has a very big component in producing apathy, and we would be very worried about that in Parkinson's because that's one of the factors we keep battling. So I think the expert opinion around cannabinoids is that not yet, but it's not, and certainly not the use of cannabis, because it's got a much, what we call a dirty pharmacology. That is, it has a much broader effect and produces a much greater likelihood of producing apathy. But it may well be that the newer cannabinoids actually have a place in controlling dyskinesia and some of these involuntary processes that occur with Parkinson's.
I'm interested to know why it is better to walk in the morning compared to the afternoon or even in the evening. Not in this weather, but in the summer, let's say.
You mean in general terms, or you're saying for a particular person with Parkinson's?
In general terms.
Oh, look, I think it doesn't really matter when you walk. I think the only thing is don't walk before you go to bed. I think the thing is that if you walk, what it does is that it alters the things, the levels of adrenaline in the body and cortisol, etc., are all going to be increased. And most people don't feel like sleeping after exercise for probably 2 hours. And so there's no particular reason why you shouldn't walk in the afternoon or in the evening. It's really more just keeping it away from bedtime. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I'm interested in the neuroprotective effects attributed to a ketogenic diet. I wondered if you might like to comment on that.
I'm with difficulty. So a ketogenic, just as for in general terms, the ketogenic diet is ketogens are byproducts of the metabolism of fats and carbohydrates, which then are released into the body, particularly in a starving setting. And I think that it's probably not so much that it's the ketogenic diet per se that is doing it, but it's a way of switching on this autophagy mechanism that I spoke about. So in diabetes, which is one of the ways in which we get ketones and ketogenic processes involuntarily, there is some key molecules that seem to be involved in switching a cell, not just a nerve cell, between building up the cell's reserves and what we call anabolic, or breaking them down, which we call catabolic. And that seems to be very important also in switching this autophagy mechanism. And so I think our thinking is that it's somehow rather tied in with that, but it's not as simple as that, because a ketogenic diet is not the same thing as starving simply. Yeah, and so I think that, and the reason I'm saying I'm not very well is that I don't think it's known exactly why it seems to do.
The first two phases of Parkinson's disease that you describe, you don't distinguish kind of carbohydrates and sugars from other kind of foods that might be more ketogenic.
Yeah, so all I'm really saying there is that for most people, it's fairly simple to say, how do you lose weight? And if you focus on sugars initially and portions, then often the fats will follow along behind. And so it's really for that reason, rather than, I was simplifying it rather than actually saying that it should be no fats. I think fats are quite important. Yeah. Any other questions, or shall I let you go home? Here's one over here.
I think mine might have been an extension of this gentleman's. I was interested in understanding the role of what research has been done around nicotine in terms of either preventing or prolonging, slowing down the progression of Parkinson's, either in early stage patients or later stage patients. I've read a bit about that recently.
Yeah. Yeah. So the question is, what's the role of nicotine as a protective drug in Parkinson's? And the reason that there's a question around nicotine in the first place is that Parkinson's is one of the few diseases which you're more likely to get if you don't smoke, less likely to get if you have smoked. So that's led to the view that there must be one theory is there's something protective about nicotine that in this process, and that's certainly a possibility, and I'm going to talk about that first and then go and talk about the other possibility. So nicotine is a small molecule that has many types of receptors. Now, a receptor is a protein that sits on a cell, including nerve cells, which can listen to a chemical and cause a set of signals inside the cell. So it's the way in which, say, smokers, when they take the nicotine goes inside the brain and to other parts of the body, binds to a nicotine receptor, and that then leads to a set of events inside the nerve cell. Now, that sounds easy, but there are actually quite a number of types of receptors for nicotine, and they all have different actions and different roles. And there are indeed nicotine receptors or types of nicotine receptors on dopamine cells, and that's probably why we get addicted, or people get addicted. It's not the whole story, but it's probably one of the reasons, because again it comes back to this point that dopamine release directly or indirectly is involved. However, it's not been easy to show that these particular receptors, so when you look at other nicotine receptors, they do have a protective role, but these particular ones don't seem to actually go in the right direction. So it doesn't rule out the fact that nicotine directly could have a protective role, but it's probably not directly on the receptors on the dopamine cells. So it's still a little bit unclear as to whether in fact there's a way in which nicotine could actually slow down the progression of disease, but it certainly led to some attempts in the pharmaceutical industry to find ways of testing this, and it's been tested in animal models and the results are unclear. However, there's another explanation which may or may not be right, but it's worth thinking that there's another reason. So nicotine is one of the most potent drugs of addiction, and in general terms you can say that people who are prone to use addictive drugs have a lower level of dopamine in their brain, and they take the addictive drugs to stimulate and increase the amount of dopamine in the brain. Put it on the other side, that people who don't tend to take addictive drugs have a higher level of dopamine in the brain and therefore don't use it. Dopamine is a very toxic molecule and that's why it's been chosen as a signaling molecule. It exchanges electrons, and whenever there's electrons around, damage to proteins and other things can happen. And we know that dopamine itself can be a damaging and oxidative molecule and cause injury to nerve cells. So there's this question about whether in fact having too much dopamine in the cell has a lot of useful things early on in life, not least of which is you don't smoke, but it probably leads to also behaviours which Mr. Hockey would like, because it leads to people not feeling entitled, being diligent, doing their job, turning up and work on time, doing all of the right things, making them model members of society, and for that reward you're at risk of getting Parkinson's. So there might be another mechanism rather than just saying it's the nicotine that protects you. It may be the factor that says you don't use nicotine that actually puts you at risk. So we don't know, but they're the two ideas that people have. Shall I let you go home? Yeah. Good night. Oh, one last question. Yeah. One last question, then we'll quit.
Professor, do you see brain stem research as having any role in PD treatment?
Yes, I do. Not yet. I certainly wouldn't advocate going to China or Germany or spending a lot of money, because that has not been proven to work. It will have a role, and I think it's getting closer, and there's some trials that are seriously beginning and may actually be useful. But it will have a very narrow focus, and that is that it will be repairing the dopamine system, and Parkinson's is more than the dopamine system. So I don't think we should be seeing it as a way of slowing down the whole thing, but it may be a very effective way of treating a particular component of the Parkinson's picture. Why don't you come and talk to me and let all these people go home? Yeah.
Thank you for the talk, Professor.
It's a pleasure.